thank you all for coming out. And this, I'm told this is the height of springtime up here in Toronto. So thank you for coming out of the beautiful weather and flowers and all the things that springtime bring. I'm very happy to be here. I was here once before many years ago, but that was in the summer. And I took my family up to cottage country. A Tale of Two Exiles. When you think exile, most people think first of us. Ours is well known. Ours is very long. A lot of people also know about a much, much more recent exile, that of the Tibetan people, who their country was overrun by China in 1950 and was completed in 1959. The leadership of the country fled. I'll show you. And they began to wonder, well, now what? We don't know how soon we're going to get back, and what we do, our religion, that's very important to us and maybe to somebody else. So how do we keep that going? How do we maintain a culture when there's no country to support that culture? So Dalai Lama noticed that an awfully large number of the Westerners who were his students, his translators, his friends, were Jewish. So he decides, you know, if we want to understand how to keep our religion going in exile, we got to get some expertise here. So 8 of us were invited to be his guest for an extended conversation about exile and surviving exile. So that's the talk, or the Dalai Lama and me. It's just been unbelievable fortune that I've known him for many, many years. So why am I doing it that way? So this talk is about who is the Dalai Lama, first of all. So we're going to look at the Dalai Lama, first from the outside, historical, the things you know, the things Lowell Thomas and all reported about back when. And also from the inside, what does he mean in Tibetan Buddhist culture? I mean, we all know that he reincarnates and he's discovered and he continues. How does that work? I'll tell you. So there's an inside and an outside kind of knowledge. But there's another way of knowing someone, and since Professor Novak mentioned dialogue, this goes back to my very early love affair with the writings of Martin Buber and his philosophy of dialogue and interreligious dialogue. So, you know, Buber writes there's an objective way, there's a subjective way, but in between those, and the most real way is this way of dialogue, what's in between us, rather than what's just in them or out of them. In between. So I'm going to show you the Dalai Lama from in between, from dialogue, from someone I've been talking with for many years and who indeed is enormously important in my personal life. So you're going to learn about the Dalai Lama in 3 different approaches. Fine. You're going to learn about the remarkably deep and remarkably sincere affection that many peoples in my part of the world, South Asia, feel for us Jews. So you're going to learn to see yourself differently once you see how the Dalai Lama sees us. We come to know ourselves through our reflections in others. So what we've had historically is reflected back at us: hostility, murderous rage, and so on and so on. Most people we've met have not liked us very much. But what an amazing thing it is to meet a person and a people who see us in an entirely different frame, right? Not Christ killers, not usurers, not, whatever the stereotypes are, not at all. but bearers of a respected and ancient tradition that has parallels in their own. So that's how we're going to do it. So, who is the Dalai Lama from the outside point of view? I imagine you know most of this. I will not go into detail. But of course, he was, so to speak, the king of Tibet. And there in this map, you see Tibet. And you see Tibet bigger than China. Well, I've got to admit, this is a Tibetan version of the map. And you see up in the blue there, East Turkestan, which is where there's so many troubles with the Muslim minority in Tibet today. Right? The Muslim minority in China today, actually in East Turkestan. But Dalai Lama was simultaneously the supreme spiritual authority for not only Tibetans, but for people who adhere to that form of Buddhism. Okay, that's not, yeah. So from the outside, China invaded Tibet in 1950. For 9 years, there was an increasing usurpation of Tibetan cultural institutions by the Chinese. It's all complete just about today. So the Dalai Lama was installed as the Dalai Lama in Lhasa, and there he is as maybe about 4 years old when he has been identified and recognized and gets to sit in the throne of the Dalai Lama there. But he hasn't really, obviously, come into his full powers yet. He lived in the Potala Palace, 15th century structure. When it was built, it was the largest building in the world. It's very imposing, and this was his home. And he describes it very beautifully, what it's like to grow up there in his book, My Land and My People. In 1959, after trying to negotiate and compromise with the Chinese, in 1959, the situation had become intolerable. The Chinese began to realize the Tibetan people were not about to give up on their beloved leader. They were not going to hand over their culture quite so easily as anticipated, so there were more and more conflicts. Many Tibetans died, and at the urging of the people around him, the Dalai Lama and about 125,000 other Tibetans escaped. And they went in the winter across the Himalayan mountains from Tibet to India. It's colder there than here even, and the mountain, and it's got 20-some thousand foot mountains all around it. People die trying to do this, but he did. He escaped, and he made it. He got to India, still young, 1959, soon after his arrival. And the people and the government of India welcomed the Tibetans. And here is the prime minister at the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, with the young Dalai Lama. Everyone assumed that there would be very temporary visit to India, and they'd soon go back to their country. Either they'd settle something with the Chinese, or the United Nations would do something, or something would happen. They thought it was very short residency, but after a couple of decades, they realized this is longer than we thought. So they gave him a town, a beautiful little town in the Himalayas called Dharamshala, which is where he lives to this day. You see there on the left side of the screen his private Tibetan temple. I mean, everyone goes there, but that's the Dalai Lama's temple. And there he is in his teaching throne, doing what he does. And Tibetans have set up a somewhat comfortable existence in India. It's something like we might have felt in Babylon. But like us, how could we forget Jerusalem when we were in Babylon? So how can Tibetans forget Lhasa when they're in India? Very similar kind of feeling. And in India, he's a celebrity, but not like he is internationally. This is 1984, before he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this photo my wife took, he was giving a talk to the local Rotary Club of this small city. Now, the Rotary Club of Dharamsala is not as prestigious a venue as the Jewish Studies Center at the University of Toronto, let us say that. But those things don't matter to him. He is as forthcoming, he cares as much about his talks to the most humble of audiences, as well as to tens of thousands in stadia and arenas. So that's who he is. He's the leader of the people in both spiritual and political sense. He, a few years ago, resigned as the political leader and handed that off to someone, but he still speaks with authority. And he's certainly the spiritual leader, not only of the Tibetan people and not only of Buddhists, but I would hazard, he is the most admired religious figure in the world today, if not the very close to it. So that's the outside, and he lives in exile, and he spreads his teachings all over the world. He travels a great deal. He's now in his 80s, slowing down a bit, but he promises to live till 100. And of course I said, no, why not 120? But we'll see. So what does this person mean? I mean, this is a fantastic story I'm telling you. This kid is discovered at 3 years old to be an incarnation of the previous, and they find him and they train him, and he becomes this tremendously significant religious leader. Well, so you need 3 ideas from Tibetan Buddhist tradition. One is rebirth. Buddhists believe, almost all Buddhists believe, that our karma, our actions, our desires will have to reach a consequence. Nothing happens that doesn't go unaddressed, the way they see the cosmos. It's an orderly cosmos. So if I do something, there has to be some consequence to what I do. If I'm kind and generous, or if I'm mean and nasty, it'll come back to me. But you and I and anybody can see that the effects of people's actions are not always visible to us. Right? And so every religion in the world, in one way or another, comes up with some kind of afterlife retribution or reward. Right? So we go to Olam Haba if we're lucky. We go to Gehenna maybe. And so every religion has this idea. And the Buddhist idea is rebirth, that the consciousness part of us seeks new birth. Okay, that's all Buddhism. In the northern schools of Buddhism, there is a special practice called the Bodhisattva Path. A bodhisattva, bodhi means enlightened. Sattva comes from shakta, meaning hero, energy. So a bodhisattva is someone who intensely strives to attain enlightenment, always for the welfare of others. Right? So bodhisattvas, they call a future Buddha. The Dalai Lama is considered a future Buddha. Avalokiteshvara, this figure you see here, is one of the preeminent bodhisattvas who's somewhere in some kind of heaven or something. He's known as Chenresik in Tibetan, Avalokiteshvara, he who looks down benevolently on the world. He is the personification of compassion. And in Buddhism, always Northern Buddhism, wisdom, compassion, enlightenment, and good deeds, they always go together. So, this deity, if we may call him that, Avalokiteshvara or Chenresik, manifests, I want to say incarnate, but let me get exact, manifests in this and other worlds repeatedly to help beings wherever they may be. Right? So there's a realm of beings, according to Tibetan Buddhism, called hungry ghosts. People have so much taiva, so much desire, that their next life becomes an embodiment of desire. And they're these kind of ghosts, their head is big as a mountain, their body is as big as a range of mountains or something, and their mouth is the size of an eye of a needle, and their throat, their neck is like a straw. So they're hungry, big eyes, big body to fill, but no way to take the food in. Right? This is suffering. This is suffering. And people who are very greedy in one way or another, they're going to suffer. So Chenrezig goes into their realm and gives them milk to drink to cool their fever, their hunger, and so forth. He goes into the realm of the animals, because animals are seen in Tibet not the way we do, not so uplifting necessarily, but as really suffering a lot. They have Tibetan for animals, pungdo, bowed head, no options, just walking, and somebody's eating them or working them. So he goes into the animal realm and helps them. He goes into the hell realms and helps them. And he comes into the human realms, and he comes into Tibet. Avalokiteshvara manifests in Tibet to help people, and guess who that takes, what form that takes? That is the Dalai Lama. He's a manifestation of the principle of compassion. If, I hope, maybe you ever have seen or get to see him, or even if you watch him, his lectures on television, that will come through to you. If you've seen him, if you've heard him, that remarkable compassion is there. The third element, so there's rebirth, there's the Bodhisattva Path and the emphasis on compassion, and finally there's death yoga. You may have heard of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This is a new translation that the Dalai Lama wrote the introduction for. I first read this book when I was a teenager and beginning college. It turned my life. It was the most fascinating thing I had ever read in my life. It is written in the 8th century by a Buddhist saint, and it tells you exactly what happens between death to rebirth and everything in between. And it tells you, it's a yoga, it tells you how to remain calm, how to overcome your fears, your attractions, and how to recognize all the frightening beings in the netherworld. They're all projections of our minds. And so this book is an instruction in how to remain calm through this terrifying process. And if you remain calm, then you can choose your next birth. And if you're a bodhisattva, you choose your next birth in a way that's to be of the most benefit to other people. That's a very brief take on what the Dalai Lama is in Tibetan culture. Everybody's reborn. Bodhisattvas are practice compassion above all else. And some meditators, big-time meditators, practice death yoga so they can remain conscious through dying, intermediate, reborn. They practice for that sometimes with dream yoga, by the way. And we've all had, I think, a little experience like that where some people, when they practice, can stay conscious as they fall asleep and stay conscious as they dream and conscious as they wake up. That's the practice. Now, we've all had what gets called lucid dreaming, where you're dreaming something and you know it's a dream. Ever have that? I had one. I usually find a $100 bill. And I know I'm dreaming. So I'm smart, though. I'm going to put this in my pocket. So when I wake up, I'll still have the $100. Hasn't worked yet. But the idea of consciousness, being aware through dying, intermediate stage, and rebirth is an amazing idea. So I told myself, I think I was about 19, I've got to read this in the original language. See, I was a text man even as a teenager. I believed in texts. I still do. So I did. I learned enough. And I've been through this several times with different teachers. It's good enough like this. Okay, so that's the background, who he is from the inside and the outside. You've probably heard about dialogue in 1990 with the Dalai Lama and 8 Jewish philosophers, scholars, rabbis, whatnot. And I was asked to be part of that 8-person delegation. There's that book by Roger Kamnes, The Jew and the Lotus. It's a good book. It's a good book. And here we all are with the Dalai Lama, sort of the end of our meeting. As I mentioned before, the Dalai Lama wanted to learn the Jewish secret for how to preserve religion and culture while in exile. A familiar Streimel or something to you. One of the members of the delegation was my good friend, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. It's very important in this because to talk to a Tibetan mystic, as the Dalai Lama is, as a Jew, you'd better be a Jewish mystic, unless you talk about something else, right? So Zalman, very enthusiastic fellow, brings charts. He, the 4 levels of creation, the Sphirot, and he's drawing all these diagrams and talking this and that. And the Dalai Lama is just rapt attention, looking at him. And once in a while, he turned to a lot of other lamas around him. Oh, what did he say about that? And they discuss a little bit. It was really amazing. And one time, Zalman talks about angels. You know, there is in Kabbalah an important angelology. This got the Dalai Lama even more enthusiastic. And the Dalai Lama said, now tell me about that angel. What color is that angel? How many arms and how many legs? What does he hold in each hand? Does he have wings? And like this, and back and forth and back and forth. Is there an angel? Everyone is a guardian angel. Yes, we believe that too. Dalai Lama says, do you believe that each nation has a guardian angel or deity? Yes, we certainly do that. You know, we certainly believe that we are protected by Hashem. And so they're going back and forth. And Zalman says to the Dalai Lama, and you know, Your Holiness, if I do my job well, and you do your job well, Chenrezig is speaking through you, and our tradition is speaking through me. Our angel, our God, is speaking through me. Now, he's talking about all these angels, and everybody else in the room, the Jews, are sort of scratching our heads. Now, we've heard there's angelology in Kabbalah, but it was never something alive, or frankly, to me, particularly meaningful, though of course it is to others. But here, that was one of the most important bridges that the Jewish group could make with the Dalai Lama. This is at that event in 1990. Oh, so one thing we did, one of the members of the delegation was a professor at Hebrew University, now at Chicago, called Paul Mendes Floor. So Paul brought with him a replica Sefer Torah, which he gave to the Dalai Lama, not proper parchment, but in a nice case. And that still sits in his prized bookcase right behind his throne where he teaches, is a Torah. He also brought a formal invitation from the government of Israel to the Dalai Lama to visit, and he's been there a number of times. And he brought some seeds from Jaffa oranges. Now, we were all put up by the Dalai Lama at his sister-in-law's house, known as Kashmir Cottage, and she's known as Rinchen Dolma. And she's a wonderful, wonderful person. She is the one who does more to help Tibetan women, Tibetan nuns especially, get better education. Absolutely wonderful. And she said, Professor Katz, I've got to show you this. Come outside, go around. She says, you see this orange tree? Little oranges on it. Those are from the seeds that Paul brought us. And, you know, all the time that in 1990, what are the seeds we're planting? What fruit is this going to bear? This whole enterprise of dialogue. What's going to come of it? And here's something very, very tangible. So it's the end, and we're staying at our hotel in New Delhi. And there's Zalman, and there's me. And who do you run into in the hotel lobby but Ram Dass? if you know who Ram Dass is, that's him. A Jewish guy who became a Hindu guru and was fired from Harvard with Leary for LSD research and all that stuff, but a great character. So we all decided, look, it's just about time for afternoon prayers, for mincha. I knew. Let's go to the Delhi synagogue and we can pray there. It'd be very nice. Okay, yeah, let's go. So come on, Ram Dass, you come along. Okay. So we go there and the praying is ethereal. It's just beautiful. We kept doing one and more psalms after psalms and chanting, and it was a beautiful service. And then I suggest, let's go out for dinner. I know, it's really strict vegetarian restaurant. You can trust it. Okay. So I went out to dinner and we have a lovely meal of South Indian food. And it just so happens it's a long table, and Ram Dass is right across from me. We're chatting. I had met him back then briefly. And then it comes time to chant Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. So we're chanting. After we're done chanting, Ram Dass leans over. Excuse me. That was a very nice tune you were singing. What was it? That broke my heart. That breaks my heart. Brilliant man. Deep reservoirs of a good heart, good spirituality. Growing up Jewish and never heard the grace after meals being chanted. So he became a Hindu. So, who's the Dalai Lama then? We had just moved into our new house in Miami Beach in 1995. It was Sunday, just moved in. And there's still boxes all over this and that. We're unpacking, it's August. And the phone rings. It was the Dalai Lama. Well, it was the Dalai Lama's assistant who was with him. Professor Katz, yes. His Holiness is at the Miami airport right now. He's on his way to, I forget, Argentina or Brazil. Would you like to come and, spend some time? Sure. Shower, get dressed, go over there. There we are with our then very small son, who was singularly unimpressed with the whole event, it seems. And it was just a wonderful few hours we spent, so that I don't know what possessed me. You know how it is. I asked the Dalai Lama, "Sir, I invite you to come to my university to receive an honorary PhD. Would you do it?" He says, "Yes." Okay. So we're driving home. I said, what have I just done? You can't do that, So Monday morning, I called up the president of the university. I just spoke with him yesterday, a great guy. And I said, I did something, sir. What'd you do? He says, well, I invited the Dalai Lama to receive an honorary doctorate from us. What? Yeah, and he accepted. You can't do that. I know. He said, there are procedures, to give someone an honorary doctorate, anybody who's an academic knows that's a long, drawn-out procedure. So the president says to me, well, we'll work it out. So they rushed it through, and, later the president said this was the greatest day in the history of my university. But he did it. And this is the first visit. We erected a peace monument in the honor of his visit. May peace prevail in the world, and we had it written in 16 languages. And there's the Dalai Lama, and everybody's throwing rose petals. It was just lovely. And that peace monument, still people, and we put a plaque there, the Dalai Lama dedicate, this and that. And that still is a kind of inspiration around the campus. So that was 1999. Then he came a few times to visit with us, 2004 and 2010. There we are. But in 2009, an awful thing happened to us. Universities are cutting back left and right. So my university and my good friend, the president, decide to save a little bit of money, we'll eliminate the religious studies department, which I had been brought there to start as the first chair. This was my child. So, and it happened, it was Good Friday. That we got the word on that, because just before Pesach and just before Easter, and all of us had awful holidays that year. Well, after I got over the shock a little bit, I said, well, let's see what's to do. So, when I first came there to be a chair of a Department of Religious Studies, public university commitments to the local community, I made it my business to meet all the major religious leaders around Miami. It was just fun, and I want to tell them what we're doing and so forth. So when our department was told it was going to be eliminated, I wrote to everybody I knew, all the religious leaders around Miami, and I said, this is what's happening. Please write to the president, do something to help. And I said, what the heck? I sent one of those to the Dalai Lama too. So a month passes. I get on my computer in the morning, and there's an email from the Dalai Lama. And it says, of course, his secretary sends him, His Holiness thought you would like to see the attached letter. I open the letter. It's a letter to my president, and the Dalai Lama says all the right things why in this world we need to understand religions, politics, all this, that. We need a religious studies department. And he talks about Buddhist, beautiful letter. But he says, I understand the financial difficulties that you're facing. So on my part, encloses my check for $100,000. And I will come and help you raise more to keep that department going. Literally, on the floor. I just fell out of my chair. This was the last thing in the world I expected, and even beyond that, the last thing in the world I'd ever ask of him to do. So what I did then, a little sneaky, I sent a copy of that letter to every person in the media I had ever known and asked them to share it. Since I've traveled around a lot, I know journalists in many places. Within days, this story of how the Dalai Lama helps this unknown university with a stupid Department of Religious Studies was literally CNN, Time, Newsweek, New York Times, South China Morning Post, Times of India, you name it. This was a story that spread around the globe within days. I checked and found out that indeed my university had deposited the check. I had him. I knew it. Because the whole world knows that the Dalai Lama gave him money to not cancel the department. And then if they did cancel the department, it's a slap in the face of the Dalai Lama. So guess what? The department's still there and doing very nicely. Thanks to him. Now, I'm telling you that I want you to understand this is a highly spiritual person. He's one of the great spiritual figures in the world. But he knows how the world works. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yeah, it's a lot of money. He had just won a Nobel Prize. He had his own fund of money. He had it. And he sent it to us knowing what the effect that would have in the world. What cleverness, what worldly savvy going together with this talk of angels and meditation and reincarnation and so forth. He's all of that. I remember this time my wife took this photo. It's somewhere there. Yeah. Now we were fairly young then, and she was contributing stories from India and Sri Lanka to the Christian Science Monitor. So I said, look, we'll go to Dharamsala. I probably can get an interview with the Dalai Lama, because I had known him since 1973. So she calls her editor at the Monitor and says, look, I think I can get an invitation, an interview with the Dalai Lama. No way, you can't do that. So of course we did. Our bureau chief in Delhi has been calling to set up an appointment for years. That's not how things work. You show up, you go to his office, you ask to see him, and you just relax. And a few days, a week later, at least then, you could do it. So she's sitting there interviewing, a big break for her in her career. And she has her little tape recorder, as it was back then, and she's interviewing him. And Dalai Lama says, stop. Check your battery. Yeah, the battery died. So he sends one of his people to go get new batteries and put them in there. Now, that's to tell you his awareness of trivial things as well. The Dalai Lama, I'm going to tell you the best statement. Nah, I won't do that one. So he came back. Now, when word got out around Miami of what the Dalai Lama was doing, one of my colleagues is the Dean of Computer Science, and I'd actually take him on an Israel fam trip for faculty, who's a Jain. Jainism is a minority religion in India, akin to Buddhism, smaller, anyway. So I was buddies with him and his family. So he comes to my office and said, what do you do with Jainism in your department? I said, well, in my Religions of India course, I spend 2 weeks. He says, would you like to do more? I said, you bet. He said, well, the Jain community needs some religious leadership. We want to bring some nuns over to minister to us, but we could, for visa and other purposes, they could teach at the university, and we'll cover all the costs and everything. Just get it started. Okay. So that goes on a few years, and it's going very well. We're sending students to India. We're bringing professors and students to do masters with us. It's going great. And so the Jains come back to me and say, look, this is going well. Let's up it. What should we do? So I said, well, how about a professorship or a center or endow something? It's okay. So within a matter of a couple months there, they were to check for $1 million like everybody else. So during the visit he made to us in 2011, there with my wife and son and him, he met with the Jain community for the, the formal check handover presentation, and to thank the Jains for joining him in this effort. So, so I'm going to end this. So what does all this mean? We've preserved our religion for 2,000 years, and then we got Israel. So, and we kept hearing in Dharamsala, we went to this one lecture by the Dalai Lama, nothing to do with us, but he's talking about the Jews. He says, we admire the Jews so much for their great determination and strength of character that despite so much opposition and persecution, somehow they managed to persevere. We admire them. They're our role models, he says. Then while I'm there, somebody gives me a little booklet that was published on some civic occasion in Tibetan culture. It was in Tibetan, written by a prominent young man, and it's called An Outline of the History of Israel. And this was published on the occasion of a political event in Tibetan history. Right? And the little pamphlet, which I translated, talked about how they talked about the Zionist movement at great length, right? And how wonderful it was, and how we got to emulate them. This fellow's a little bit militant, so his favorite of the Zionist groups was the Lehi. Then the most revisionist Jabotinsky strand of Zionism was what the kind they admired. Think about that. Anyway, so from political reasons to noticing a battery's out to talking about angels. While we were going up to Dharamsala, some of the rabbis wanted to know about meditation in Tibet, and especially the Dalai Lama. So I was telling you about a meditation that's called visualization meditation. And what one does, now let me go back there, I'll show you something. These are Tibetan paintings, religious paintings. So you might take this one, and your job would be, with first verbal instruction of each step, how to construct this image in your mind. How many arms, what's in this arm, what's in that arm, What kind of crown, colors, what's it doing? And gradually the thing starts to talk to you, chanting holy words. Right? And it takes on its own life. Visualization. This is an aspect of enlightenment, right? Compassion. So if we visualize it and identify with the visualization, we get closer to enlightenment itself. We create this reality for ourselves. That's the highest, one of the very highest meditation techniques in Tibet. And then, after you are able to hold that complex painting in your mind, which is not easy, that's the development stage of the meditation. The completion stage is you dissolve it. You melt it away into what they call emptiness or nothingness, or the basic reality of the universe. Right? So you go from form to non-form, form to non-form. So, while we are talking to him, one topic that comes up appropriately enough is Shabbat. So Yitz Greenberg was one of our group, you may know of him, and Yitz is describing Shabbat as, Shabbat harkens back to the beginning of the world, by Chul HaShamayim and all that, and then imagines how the world will be when it's redeemed. And what we do with our finest linen and china and food and wine and guests, the way that's understood by many is we live Shabbat as though the world's redeemed already. This is a taste of the world to come, Shabbat, if we observe it. All right, so we're telling the Dalai Lama about that. His interpretation is staggering. Most intelligent, worthy of Heschel. Now, remember what I said about visualization. You meditate an aspect of enlightenment, and by doing that, you become closer to enlightened. We do Shabbat as though the world were redeemed, and thereby make redemption a little bit closer. He says, so Shabbat is your people's visualization exercise? One of the most brilliant comments anyone's made, that I've ever heard anyway, that comes from a tremendous spiritual depth of his own tradition and of understanding another tradition creatively. That was one of those wow moments. That's his mind too. So strong, deep in his own tradition, that he's able to understand other traditions very, very quickly and very deeply. So, this goes back, this is 1989 back then. And this is my friend, Venerable Losang Negi. And you may have seen that these monks come around and do Tibetan ritual music, and they create mandalas out of sand, Tibetan art and all that. Well, we invited him to where I lived then, in Tampa, at the University of South Florida, to do a program. And of course, I took him to my synagogue in Tampa at the time to show him what it's like. Lovely. Then, a few years later, there was a film out based on our trip to the Dalai Lama, also called, what was it called? And whatever it's called. Jew in the Lotus. So, the temple, capital T, in Atlanta, the old leading Reform synagogue that has a great distinction of having been firebombed during the civil rights movement because they supported civil rights too much. They want to do this program. Negi, this fellow, was doing his doctorate in psychology at Emory at the time. So they brought me up from Miami to do a program. And okay, we talked Tibetan, Jewish, okay. And of course, one thing that comes up is the suffering of the Tibetan people. They lost their country and they don't have it back. So after a while, somebody in the audience says, and he gets up and his face is really red. He's very agitated. I don't know what's going to come out of him. And he says, sir, this is terrible. I didn't know about this. Look, what can we do? How can we help you? Look, we have APAC, we can help with Tibet, we can talk to the UN. Do you need money? What can we do? Negi replies, nothing. Nothing at all. You have to you don't understand. You don't understand. When we Tibetans see you Jews doing what you've done for thousands of years, he didn't know about Reform and Orthodox, we'll leave that go. When we see you still following your faith after being in exile for so long, that encourages us, and you've done more for us by being who you are than by anything else you could possibly do. Wisdom right back at us. Right back. Lao Tzu, the great Chinese sage, one of my favorite lines of his, the way to do is to be. That's it. Thank you.